Good morning. Welcome to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. I'm Kim McClary, President and CEO, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to today's program. Thank you all for your ongoing viewership and support. We're also excited about bringing back our in-person events, beginning with an exclusive members-only tour of a new exhibit at the Skirball Center that will be scheduled sometime in July. We are planning to fully reopen in-person events to the public after Labor Day. Jessica and Marian are connecting with key speakers and venues to develop a strong lineup for all of our programs. As we reintroduce our in-person programs, we will also continue to produce 1 to 2 live streams per week, including Dan Schnur's weekly Politics in the Time of Coronavirus. So you all will have a number of expanded programming to entertain you. For those of you who would like to ask Dan questions, there's a control panel on the right-hand side of your screen where you can type in your questions, and Jessica will manage your questions as usual during the Q&A portion of today's program that starts in about 35 minutes. Dan, it's time to bring you on. We have 3 great topics today.
Hey, Kim, how are you? I'm very, very excited about in-person programming again. That's going to be great.
Well, we hope to get you in person as well as your live streams. You have such a popular following and it's so large. I think they want more of you.
Well, we'll see how it survives the transition back to the real world. We might also have to think of I don't want to be overly optimistic, but maybe we'll even need to think of a new title for the series as the time of coronavirus begins to subside.
It's worth thinking about. Absolutely. Let's get to your topics, and so I can get off the screen and turn this over to you. Topic number 1, when did Israel become a partisan issue in America? 2, who should vote and who shouldn't? The voting rights heats up. And 3rd, what to do about China, Biden's biggest foreign policy issue. Hopefully we'll have time to get to China today. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you very much, Kim. And thanks to all of you for being with us again. And I'll hope to have the chance, whether it's at the July event or in the future, to have the opportunity to meet those of you in person, at least those of you who live in the greater Los Angeles area. But in the meantime, as Kim mentioned, we've got 3 topics today. And I will mention before we dive into the first, as I think many of you know, today is the 1-year anniversary of George Floyd's death. And of course, Mr. Floyd's death, tragic death, triggered an extraordinary conversation in this country about race relations, about discrimination, about police reform, and about public safety. I just wanted to let you know that next week we'll be talking about that issue. President Biden is meeting with Mr. Floyd's family today at the White House. And so I wanted to wait just a few more days to see what we saw, what we learned from that visit. And then also to see the progress that Congress is making on the Police Reform Act, the George Floyd Act, as it's been named. So count on that discussion for next week. Although, as always, I'll be more than happy to talk about any topic that you want during the Q&A session that will kick off at the bottom of the hour. So let's talk about Israel. There's obviously a ceasefire in place now between Israel and Hamas, and I'd like to get into a discussion about partisan feelings and the growing partisan divide about Israel in just a second. But now that there is a ceasefire in place, I think we should start out with even a more basic question for all of you to consider. So Claire, if you wouldn't mind posting the first question. All right, this is a pretty straightforward one. Now that the ceasefire has been achieved, my question for all of you is, did either Israel or Hamas improve their international standing once the conflict had subsided? Did Israel improve its standing? Option 1. Did Hamas improve their standing in the eyes of the world? Option 2. And options 3 and 4, but both did, or finally, that neither did. And so let's see your response to that before we jump into the broader conversation. Wow, look at that. Very interesting. Not surprising, but very instructive. 77%, more than 3/4 of you, said that neither Israel or Hamas came out looking particularly good. But even more interesting, although the numbers are much smaller, is by an 8-to-1 margin, 16% of you thought that Hamas improved their standing in the eyes of the world, while only 2% said the same about Israel. And we'll come back to the politics of this, or the present day politics of this in just a second. But like we did last week, when I presented you some poll numbers on questions relating to abortion, right now we're going to look at some public opinion as it relates to Israel in the Middle East. So how big is the partisan divide in this country when it relates to issues about Israel and about Middle Eastern geopolitics? How big is that partisan divide? Well, it's pretty big. I'll give you some examples. Example number one. This is all from Pew polling, which, like Gallup, is considered to be the most respected polling done in this country on a regular basis. According to Pew, 22% of Democrats regard protecting Israel as very important. And the poll question provided a range of options: very important, somewhat important, not that important, not very important, not important at all. 22% of Democrats said that protecting Israel was very important for the United States. 61% of Republicans, almost 3 times that number, said that it was important for the U.S. When Pew asked who was to blame for the recent escalation of violence, 53% of Republicans, just over half, blamed the Palestinians. 30% of independents said it was the Palestinians' primary responsibility. 14% of Democrats blamed the Palestinians. So 53 to 14, almost a 4-to-1 margin. And to personalize it just a little bit, when Pew asked about assessment of Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister, once again, we saw roughly a 4-to-1 margin. 53% of Republicans hold Netanyahu in a positive regard, only 13% of Democrats. So we've got much more extensive polling, and I want to go back a little bit into history. And so I'm going to start out by citing a broader poll that was taken in 2020, before, of course, the recent violence broke out, just to illustrate the depths of this divide. So when asked about the dispute between Israel and the Palestinians on an ongoing basis, not the most recent outbreak, 46% of Americans said that they sympathized more with the Israelis. 16% said they sympathized more with the Palestinians. And about 4 in 10, 38%, say they're either with both or neither, or that they don't know. So 46% say Israel, 16% say the Palestinians. And that hasn't changed very much over the years. They asked a similar poll question in 1978, more than 40 years ago. And back then, 45% said they sympathized with Israel, 14% with the Palestinians, and the rest couldn't decide. So last year it was a 46 to 16 divide. In 1978, it was a 45 to 14 divide, which is inside the margin of error when it comes to public opinion polling. So really no difference whatsoever. But those are the overall poll numbers. Let's look a little bit closer at the partisan breakdown, particularly over the last couple decades, because the share of Republicans who sympathize with Israel has never been higher. As of last year's poll, nearly 8 in 10 Republicans, 79%, said they sympathized more with Israel than the Palestinians. 6% said they sympathized more with the Palestinians, 79 to 6. The Democrats, on the other hand, again, last year's polling was almost evenly divided. 27% said they sympathized more with Israel. 25% said they sympathized more with the Palestinians, and the rest said either neither or both or didn't know. So 79 to 6 for the Republicans, 27 to 25, almost a dead even split for the Democrats. Now we're going to go back just a few more years, and I think you're going to be really startled, as I was, when I talk about how quickly these attitudes have changed. In 2016, just 5 years ago and 4 years before the poll numbers I just cited, in 2016, when Democrats were asked that question, who do you sympathize with more? 43% said Israel, 29% said Palestinians. So over a period of 4 years, over the course of Donald Trump's presidency, and we'll talk more about this in a moment, Democratic sympathies as it related to the Middle East went from 43 to 29, Israel versus the Palestinians, to 27 versus 25. That's a remarkably fast shift in attitude. Now, there's an ideological divide within the party, as I'm guessing that many of you know. The share of liberal, self-described liberal Democrats who sympathize more with Israel than the Palestinians, well, that declined from 33% to 19% since 2016. That's almost the entire drop-off. Currently, nearly twice as many liberal Democrats say they sympathize with the Palestinians rather than Israel. So self-described liberal Democrats, 35 to 19, say that they're more sympathetic to the Palestinians than Israel. Self-described moderate Democrats continue to sympathize more with Israel, almost the exact reverse numbers. 35% say Israel and 17% say the Palestinians. But what I'd like to do is go back even further for some historical perspective. Now, we first began to see partisan divisions between the two parties in the US regarding Israel in the 1990s. And in the 90s, Democratic support stayed fairly stable and fairly high. But that's when Republican support for Israel began to grow. And the growth took place primarily because of the growing influence of evangelical voters in the Republican Party. And then because of the changing geopolitics of the Middle East during and after the first Gulf War, and then after September 11th. Now, Democratic support, while it stayed pretty stable through most of the 20th century, Democratic support began dropping slightly in the early mid-2000s when Ariel Sharon was Prime Minister of Israel, and then dropped somewhat more after Netanyahu was elected in 2009. But the divide, as you saw and heard a minute ago, grew much larger during the last 4 years, both a result of Trump moving Republicans to the right on these issues and younger and minority voters moving Democrats to the left. And the results can be seen in the poll numbers I cited to you just a couple minutes ago. But before we move on to the next topic, while we're talking about the Middle East, let's take a little time to look back at more recent events. So Claire, if we can post our second question, and we're going to talk about the violence over the last few weeks. How would you grade Joe Biden's handling of the recent conflict? Pretty direct. Do you give him an A, a B, a C, a D, or an F? And this is what happens when you have a college instructor as your host. Sometimes we resort to grading. So I will tell you what my grade is in just a minute. And quick plug for those of you who read my Jewish Journal column, you probably already know what I think. But let's, Claire, once they're ready, let's show what our audience has to say on this. Really interesting. 70% of you give Biden either an A or a B. 23%, a little bit less than 1/4, get an A, give him an A. 47%, a little bit less than half, give him a B. 19% give him the gentleman C. And only 11% give him a D or an F, 7% and 4% respectively. Very interesting. Now, my own opinion is while Biden took some heat along the way, I think Joe Biden aced his first foreign policy test. And I've talked about this before in the webinar. To a large degree, in my mind, this comes down to questions of experience. Now, depending on how you count such things, Biden is the most experienced individual to be elected to the presidency since either Richard Nixon or Lyndon Johnson. For the last several decades, for almost half a century, Americans have tended to look for outsiders who bring change to Washington. And I think what we've learned over the last couple of weeks is particularly on the world stage, that experience matters. And I would argue that Biden's ability to guide the combatants to a ceasefire quietly and respectfully with Israel, and by remote control with Hamas, not even talking to them directly, I think Biden reestablished the United States as a critical leader in Middle Eastern geopolitics. And in the process, for those of you who gave him a harsher grade, I'll point out that, at least in my opinion, he achieved the best possible short-term outcome for an 11-day outbreak that could have been much, much worse. Contrast that with the Gaza-Israel war in 2014. Hamas and Israel fought for 7 weeks as opposed to 11 days. And that conflict led to almost 10 times as many deaths as we saw over the last couple of weeks. Almost 2,500 residents of Gaza and Israel died in 2014. And I said just roughly 250, while still tragic, a much, much smaller death toll than in their last conflict. Now, the strongest defenders of Israel will argue correctly that a great deal of Hamas's weapons capabilities survived and will be used against Israel on another day. But Israeli security officials had been telling their American counterparts that they'd accomplished most of their military goals before Biden began to publicly encourage Netanyahu to step back. And I think what Biden did, which was very smart, is he treated Netanyahu with respect. And whether you happen to be a supporter of the Israeli leader or not, it's worth remembering that in 2014, Barack Obama and his Secretary of State, John Kerry, were much louder and much aggressive in pushing Netanyahu toward a ceasefire. And what they essentially did in 2014, Obama and Kerry, is they backed Netanyahu into a corner. And Biden, on the basis of experience, realized that that confrontational approach would be counterproductive and would simply prolong the conflict longer because Netanyahu would not want to be seen in the eyes of the Israelis as backing down. I think by keeping their conversations private and by keeping his public statements measured, Biden created space for Netanyahu to agree to a ceasefire without looking like it was the result of an external pressure. Now, Biden didn't speak out as forcefully or as quickly to end the violence as many progressives would have liked, but he paid just enough attention to the Palestinian cause and the plight of individual Palestinians, I think, to prevent a full-fledged revolt from the left. We're going to talk more in the future about the generational challenge that Biden faces within the Democratic Party on Israel. But at least for today, I'd say on a political landscape as polarized as the one we've just discussed, I'd argue that this is about as good as an American president could have done. Now, one emerging complication to keep in mind going forward is the Israel-Hamas war and a more assertive role for the United States than we've seen in recent years. To some degree, that strains U.S. relationships with Europe, because most of the Western European countries, with the exception of Germany, tend to be less visceral and vocal in their support of Israel. And so it does create some tensions there. And that might in turn create some challenges on other critical issues like China and Russia, which leads us to our second topic. And as Kim mentioned, we had to drop China as an issue last week, so I want to make sure we get to it today. And I'm gonna come to it right now. And I'm going to start out by asking all of you another question as it relates to Biden's focus and his priorities on the world stage. What do you think of Joe Biden's foreign policy priorities? Should he pay less attention to China and more to the Middle East, which seems to be what's been happening over the last few weeks? Should he pay less attention to the Middle East and more to China, which seemed to be the administration's plan until the violence broke out in Gaza? Third, he should be paying more attention to other trouble spots, not the Middle East or China, but elsewhere in the world. Or fourth, his priorities are pretty much what they should be. And Claire, what does our group have to say on this one? All right, it's a pretty supportive group for Joe Biden. His priorities are what they should be, 60%, but very interesting. 34% say he should pay less attention to the Middle East and more to China. And to be honest, that's probably Biden's natural instinct. It would have been fascinating to have asked this question a month ago before the violence broke out, because of course at that point Biden wasn't paying much attention to the Middle East, at least not to Israel, at least not as it related to Israel's relationship with the Palestinians. So if this makes the 34%, just over a third who said he should be paying less attention to the Middle East and more to China, I think it can offer you some reassurance here. Because while the world is paying attention to the crisis in the Middle East, and Biden has obviously been giving it a lot more time and attention than he had planned, and China, of course, is still playing the long game, continuing to move forward toward their longer term economic, military, and other goals. But even during the crisis in the Middle East, Biden hasn't been ignoring China either. And I'm going to give you a few examples here. Last Friday, Biden met with South Korea's President Moon. And that's only the second face-to-face meeting with a foreign leader that Biden has had so far. The first was the Japanese Prime Minister Suga. So his first two meetings face-to-face with any leaders in the world, not Canada, not Mexico, not Europe, not Middle Eastern, not Latin America. The first two foreign leaders who Biden met with were the leaders of South Korea and Japan, because Biden and his team understand that in order to deal with China as effectively as they hope to, they need to restore the relationships with allies that had historically counted on the US in that role and had become somewhat disappointed in recent years. So he's rebuilding that relationship with South Korea. He's rebuilding it with Japan. He's talking to the so-called Quad, which includes India and Australia. And meanwhile, Biden and his Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, are getting Europe lined up to support the United States in dealings with China. That was the major focus of Blinken's meeting with the G7 earlier this month. Europe had signed a trade agreement with China late last year, as you might remember, but right now they're backing away. And the reason Europe is backing away is because their concern is not economic, but it's human rights. And so as Biden and Blinken have been talking to Europe, you've seen a fundamental remaking of the Europe-China relationship. Last November and December, they were proudly proclaiming this trade deal. But now, particularly as many of Europe's governments are beginning to move leftward, I think my guess is we're going to see that China's treatment of the Uyghurs and their dealings with Hong Kong and Taiwan are going to become even bigger issues. In Germany, in particular, the Green Party is growing in strength very rapidly, and they've made very, very strong arguments about China's human rights and security stances. And so, unlike Angela Merkel, who had been a very loud advocate of increased trade between China and Europe, we might be seeing this going in the other direction. And then just quickly, one other unfolding story, which has just started to get attention in the last couple days, as Biden prepares to build support for a more assertive approach and a more multilateral approach to China. There's been a story that's just broken in the just this week, over the weekend and yesterday and today. And it seems that the United States is now moving to assert much greater influence over a scientific investigation that the World Health Organization is leading into the origins of COVID-19. And specifically, they've started an inquiry into how the new coronavirus started spreading. Now, you may remember that Trump wanted to pull out of the WHO. Biden has not only rejoined it, but it's been reported has his administration working very aggressively to steer the WHO toward a more in-depth inquiry into what happened in China that caused the coronavirus to break out. It's been reported in the last few days that US intelligence shows that 3 Chinese researchers in the Wuhan lab became sick enough in the fall of 2019 that they sought hospital care. And information like this could add a huge amount of weight to calls for a fuller probe from both the United States and our allies as to whether the COVID-19 virus may have escaped from a laboratory. Now, Trump made these accusations occasionally over the course of his last year or so in office, but is always laced with the idea that China did it intentionally. And there is no one in the Biden administration suggesting that China did this on purpose. But if a renewed WHO investigation into China shows that this was not a natural occurrence of a virus passing from animals to humans, but rather something that was created, even unintentionally, even by accident in a Chinese lab, well, that's going to put China on the defensive in a huge way with the global audience, including many of the countries which they've been working hard to build relationships in recent years. Biden understands that the way he handles China could be just as definitional for his presidency as the way he handles COVID. And so this still looks like pre-game maneuvering, but it's really interesting to watch how the US is preparing for an eventual showdown with China, not militarily, hopefully, but economically, diplomatically, and otherwise. And we've talked a lot over the months about Biden's multilateralist approach to foreign policy and the way he's putting his ducks in a row to prepare for a more assertive path with China is very interesting to watch. And even when the headlines focused on another part of the world over the last few weeks, it's something that that Biden and his administration have continued on apace. And once again, I hesitate to sound like a cheerleader for the president or any other politician, because that's not my job in this webinar. But I think it is encouraging that even while crises erupt in other parts of the country, that this work that he identified as being one of his top priorities continues. All right, let's move on to the third issue, and we'll talk for a few minutes about voting reform. And before I get into my thoughts on it, before we open it up to your questions, I would like to ask a question of all of you. So the question is, how important is this issue to you? Both Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer have made this the first bill, H.R. 1, House Representatives Bill 1, and S1, Senate Bill 1. And generally that happens when congressional leaders believe an issue is of particular importance. Question for you, how important is voting reform? Is it the single most important issue for Biden and Congress to address? Is it one of the few most important? One of many important issues? Maybe of some or minor importance, but no important at all. So how important is this voting reform issue to you? 25% of you, a quarter of you, and that's interesting and I'll admit a little bit surprising to me, say that it's the most important issue that Biden and Congress could be working on. 51% say one of the most important issues. That's more than 3/4 say the most or one of the few most important issues. And then the numbers decline from there. 17% say one of many important issues, and very few of you saying of minor importance or no importance. So I may be disappointing those 3/4 of you who talked about how important you thought the issue is. Because right now, it seems that while originally it looked like this was an issue that the Democrats were going to push hard, it doesn't look like that's going to be the case. Most Republicans are lined up against it, but so are some centrist Democrats. And President Biden barely raises the issue at all. So it'd be easy to come to the conclusion that this is one of those bills that's more effective as a campaign issue to motivate the party's base than an actual attempt to change the law. So let's talk a little bit about what the bills would actually propose. More broadly, the package would expand voting rights and making both early voting and mail voting much easier. It would change campaign finance laws, primarily through the introduction of a public financing mechanism in congressional races. It would limit partisan gerrymandering by creating the kind of commissions citizens commission that we have here in California to oversee redistricting and reapportionment in every state. It would create new ethics rules for federal office holders. There's a lot of details, and I'd encourage you to read up on it that we're not going to have time to go through today. But I would ask you to tell us which provisions of the bill you think are most important. Is it easier, earlier mail voting? Is it stopping gerrymandering and doing fairer districting? Is it public financing of campaigns? Or is it the requirement on the ethics part of the bill that the president must release his tax returns? Or is it something else? What do you think? Wow, look at that. Very interesting. Wow. 54% of you say stopping gerrymandering, and I would have to agree with you on that one. I did a lot of work on redistricting reform early in my career, and it's an issue that I hold of particular import. But the others are too. 27% say easier early mail voting. 13% say public financing of campaigns. Only 1% say that the president, it's important that the bill include a provision that the president releases tax returns. Now, my own opinion is that while this bill looks pretty hopelessly stalemated right now, is that a more narrowly drawn bill could draw broader support and get 60 votes in the Senate. And I think that more narrowly drawn bill, to a large degree, reflects the priorities that all of you just articulated in our last poll question. My own opinion is that senators in both parties would support some type of redistricting reform and maybe a slightly less expansive early voting rules than are currently in the proposal. They'd probably support the ban on foreign money that the bill calls for, and probably the paper ballot requirements that the bill also outlines. So in order to get 10 or more Republican votes, the Democrats would probably have to drop the public funding provision of the campaign finance reform package. And they probably have to drop the presidential requirement on releasing tax returns. But I think what's left would probably be able to get 60 votes. And so I think the question for the Democrats on this one is whether getting 2/3 of a loaf is better than getting none of an ideal package. Real quickly, and then we're going to go on to your questions, of course, a minute or two late, and I apologize for that. I do think that both sides, both parties, are making a mistake on how they're approaching this issue. Republicans, when I started out in Republican politics years and years ago, before I became an independent, we always believed that a higher voter turnout would help, and that was something that Ronald Reagan talked about during his campaigns, and the attitude within the Republican Party has changed over the years toward a more restrictive approach. But as the demographic support between the two parties has shifted so dramatically, particularly with working class voters without a college education becoming a more and more important part of the Republican base, a smaller voter turnout is going to mean a lower turnout among voters with a lower level of education. And so I wonder if in the years ahead, Republicans might actually come to regret more restrictive approaches to voting, because it might end up discouraging their most loyal supporters from turning to the polls. In a low turnout election, wealthier voters and better educated voters have a disproportionate impact. And in years past, that's helped Republicans. But as the socioeconomic basis of the party shift, I'm not sure it's going to be in the GOP's favor going forward. The Democrats, we didn't show the poll numbers today, and we'll talk about it in the future when this bill does come up for a vote. But the most popular voting reform in the country right now, more than redistricting reform, more than campaign finance reform, more than early voting, the single most popular voting reform in America right now is requiring a voter ID card. And while it's not my place to argue for or against it in this program, I would say that even though voter fraud is obviously very rare, the Democrats might be making a mistake by pushing voters too hard on an issue that otherwise works so much to their political benefit. And so once again, it might be okay for the Democrats to ease up a little bit, just a little bit, on voting access in order to get the 60 votes they need in order to pass the broader bill. Anyway, I went a little bit over, but lots of things to talk about today. And since we put off China and voting reform last week, I wanted to make sure we got to them in today's conversation. So with the 25, 26 minutes that we have left, Jessica, maybe you can rejoin me and we can try to plow through the questions more quickly than normal so I can get to as many as possible.
Sounds good. Our first question, do you think most Americans know much about the different leadership in the West Bank and Gaza? If so, does it influence their sympathy?
It's a very good question. And I don't think that most Americans understand how divided the Palestinian leadership is. The Palestinian Authority, which controls the West Bank, which has become deeply unpopular, both in the West Bank and Gaza, and Hamas, which runs Gaza, which the US has designated as a terrorist organization and will not deal with directly. Hamas may or may not have become more popular on the world stage over the last few weeks. But there's no question that they've cemented their support among the Palestinian people. And so one of the real challenges for Biden going forward, and Tony Blinken's in the Middle East right now to try to get this process started, is Biden wants to demonstrate his commitment to rebuilding Gaza, but to working through the Palestinian Authority, not through Hamas, in order to rebuild the Palestinian Authority's popularity to some degree in that region. And Jessica, it's probably worth now, since we're talking about it, worth mentioning that on Thursday, I'm going to have the great privilege of doing a program at 5 o'clock with Hillel Newman, who, as many of you know, is Israel's Consul General here in Los Angeles. And General Newman's going to be joining us at 5 p.m. for an hour to talk about the recent violence and other issues. And I hope you'll join us for that. I'm really, really excited for the conversation. What else have we got?
Thank you for mentioning that. I was about to do that as well, and I'll send a link to that in the chat. This next questioner says, hasn't the media exaggerated the influence of Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, AOC, and Bernie Sanders faction, who represent less than 10% of the congressional Democrats? And I guess this is in regards to their perspective on what's happening in the Middle East.
I would say this, the Democrats who are most outspoken on this matter from the left still do represent a relatively small portion of the party. But as you probably may have seen in the poll numbers that I was citing earlier, that cohort within the Democratic Party is growing very, very rapidly. It's worth noting that only 5 years ago, a lot more Democrats said their sympathies lied with Israel than with the Palestinians. And that has become almost even. I do think, and as I've admitted to this group in the past, while I try to keep my personal politics out of these conversations, because that's not my role with this program, I will admit to all of you that I do consider myself to be a very strong supporter of Israel. And in that context, I will note that when Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Tlaib and Ilhan Omar and Ayanna Pressley were elected just a few years ago, Jerry Nadler, the Democratic congressman, who's a very loyal friend of Israel, said, oh, that's only 4 members out of our entire caucus. Well, those numbers are still small, but they're growing rapidly. And as hopefully we can talk about in a future program, the growing generational divide in this country over Israel means the ranks of those Democrats who tend to sympathize more with the Palestinians and Israel is growing rapidly and is only going to continue to grow in the years ahead.
Thank you. And I'm going to try to stay balanced in these audience questions, so bear with me here. How does one negotiate with an entity that has the destruction of Israel as a part of its constitution without that being removed from their constitution?
Well, it's a very good question. And I think what I try to remind people is that when Ariel Sharon, during his years as Israel's leader, committed for Israel to pull out of Gaza completely in order to give the Palestinians that territory for themselves, the response was not a diminution, but an escalation in violence. And I recognize that there are plenty of very smart people who would argue that that violence as a response to the Israeli pullout was based on other concessions that many believed Israel should have made and did not. But the questioner raises, I think, a very relevant point, which is how do you negotiate? And what we see Biden doing is attempting to work with the Palestinian Authority rather than Hamas, because he, in my opinion, correctly believes that there may be at least somewhat of a better potential for worthwhile conversations to take place. It means relying heavily, as we did during the fighting, on other countries in the Middle East, relying heavily on Egypt, relying heavily on Qatar, relying heavily on the United Arab Emirates. And this is where I think the Trump administration's work on the Abraham Accords where they largely formalized relationships between Israel and several Arab Gulf nations that had already been building for several years, that this is really the key to finding at some point in the future a conclusion of the conflict, is if the rest of the Arab world is willing to invest in the conversations and become a more reliable partner in the negotiations, then I think it becomes much more likely that a plausible and sustainable peace can be established. But I'll admit that I share the questioner's concern that one is simply Israel negotiating with Palestinians without the broader involvement of other Middle Eastern countries. It's much, much more difficult.
Thank you. Do you believe it is possible to solve the Palestine-Israel issue until it is recognized that it is the Palestinian people who have been wronged since UN Resolution 181, the subsequent war, and the 1949 armistice imposed Israel on 78% of the mandated territory?
So Jody Redoran, the former New York Times reporter, who was that paper's Israel bureau chief, is now the editor of a wonderful online publication called The Forward, which I think does very, very good work in covering not only Israel and the Middle East, but the American Jewish community as well. And last week, she wrote something which summarized for me a point that I've really struggled to. And what she was addressing, as the questioner is also, is that as you go back into history, both sides can find no shortage of injustices to point to as a rationale for continuing the hostilities and violence and demanding more unilateral concessions from the other side. Both the Palestinians and the Israelis can go back all the way to 1948, when Israel's founding, to many years before that. And what Jody Redoran said in her piece last Friday is she said, I feel like every piece about Israel and the Palestinians should conclude with the sentence, Abraham had two sons, Isaac and Ishmael. And then from that, we'd have to go back not just centuries, but millennia in order to get to the actual roots of the hostilities. I think ultimately, if there is going to be a lasting peace, even a tenuous one in the Middle East, it's going to be when both the Israelis and Palestinians and their supporters realize that neither side will ever feel completely made whole from the injustices that they've felt in the past, and that it's going to require both sides, both Israelis and Palestinians alike, to say there are some injustices that are not going to be corrected, and I'm going to have to be willing to accept that, Israelis and Palestinians alike, in order for us to move forward in a peaceful way. So I'm not arguing the injustice is outrageous. I'm just saying that in order to get to peace, both sides are going to have to realize that not all of them can be satisfactorily addressed.
Given the inception of the 24-hour news cycle and partisan media outlets since the Gulf War, to what degree do you attribute the increasing democratic sympathy for the Palestinian people's plight to partisan news media, for example, MSNBC?
So Jessica, I'm getting a little bit of whiplash on the questions going back and forth. You're doing a great job of balancing them. As I mentioned earlier, I think there's a lot of reasons that the partisan divide has opened. Some of it has been the growing prominence of evangelical voters in the Republican Party and their very strong support of Israel. Some of it has been the geopolitics that resulted as a result of both Gulf Wars and of September 11th. And a great deal of it, as I mentioned earlier, has resulted because particularly over the last 5 years, not only have Republicans moved further right on Israel under Donald Trump's leadership, but Democrats have moved further left as a younger and more progressive bloc has become more assertive within the Democratic Party. But I do agree that media plays a role on this, less mainstream news media than social media. Because while social media is extremely valuable for all sorts of reasons, it gives a voice to people who would otherwise not have it, it's awfully difficult for social media to provide context. So when you do see violence and destruction taking place during conflicts like we've seen over the last few weeks, it's understandable and appropriate to be outraged at that violence. But turning the previous questioner's point around, without the context of why that violence is taking place, makes it much harder to have a balanced conversation. In other words, I think for a lot of people who haven't followed the issue all that closely in the past, they became understandably and appropriately furious when they see the amount of damage being done in Gaza, because it's awfully difficult to show on a tweet or on Instagram or on Snapchat the reason the Israeli military has engaged the way they have. So mainstream media is a conversation, and it's a broader conversation, which we should probably have at some point. But I think in particular, one of the things that's been of greatest benefit to building support for the Palestinian cause in recent years has been less traditional news media and more social media.
Okay. The word Palestine is used with regard to conflict, but Hamas seems to be the aggressor. Does the Palestinian government control Hamas?
No, not in the slightest. The Palestinian Authority actually ran in elections against Hamas to see who would run Gaza several years ago, and Hamas won by a very large margin. But even in the West Bank, the Palestinian Authority is held in very low regard by Palestinians. So one of the real challenges for Israel, for the United States, and both countries' allies is to, I hate to use the term because it's somewhat pejorative, but almost prop up the Palestinian Authority by using them as the vehicle to provide aid for the rebuilding of Gaza. So Hamas, which is in my opinion rightly designated as a terrorist organization, does not continue to build support among the Palestinian people, because as Hamas builds support, it becomes less likely that an achievable peace is going to come between Israel and the Palestinians.
How much influence do you think the progressives in the Democratic Party have in energizing the current surge in violent anti-Semitic acts against Jewish people throughout the United States?
Boy, Michelle Goldberg, the very progressive New York Times columnist, wrote an excellent piece on this last night. And she argues, I think correctly, that outbreaks of violence against Jews in New York, in Los Angeles, in South Florida, and in other countries, if anything, undermines the pro-Palestinian movement. Because one of the ongoing arguments, which we don't have time to get into in great detail today, the overlap, I will call it diplomatically, between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism is one that in a large way defines this debate. And when you see Palestinian advocates engaging in violence against Jews in this country and elsewhere, it becomes harder for advocates of the Palestinian cause to make the case that anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism are completely distinct.
Thank you. All right, I know we've talked a lot about Israel. I'm going to try to pivot to some of those other topics. So if we form a coalition of European allies to address China's dominance, will sanctions be effective against them?
Sanctions will be more effective the more countries are involved in them. And if the United States can put together a set of sanctions against China that are not unilateral, as we've seen over the last couple of years, but include allies both on the Pacific Rim and in Europe, they're not going to be 100% effective, because there are always countries that will deal with China regardless of whether the United States and its allies thinks it's a good idea or not. But I think almost definitionally, the more countries involved in sanctions, the more effective they are. And given China's obvious interest to develop stronger economic relationships with Europe, if the European Union and its countries continue to move away from the kind of economic engagement they were talking about even just 7 or 8 months ago, I think that does strengthen the US hand in these discussions considerably.
Do you believe that the president's ignoring of China's adventurism in international waters and the South China Sea is in our best interests and those of our friends in Asia?
I'm not sure I agree with the premise of the question. I don't think Biden is ignoring that adventurism. And in fact, we've seen a considered increase in the US military presence in the South China Sea and in the ocean and in the waters surrounding Taiwan over the course of the last several months. It hasn't been as visible or as vocal as many would like, including the questioner. But I think, as we were talking about earlier in the program today, I think what Biden is doing is looking to rebuild a very broad multilateral coalition so that when he becomes more visible and vocal on these matters, it's with a much greater range of support. It also seems to me that in addition to the human rights concerns that have convinced Europe to back off from their trade dealings with China, the other reason for it, and this is something that Biden and Blinken have worked on quite a bit as well, is Europe's concern about China's increasing assertiveness on the military front, particularly in those waters. So it's progressing at a lower key level than I think the questioner would like, but I think ultimately it's heading in the right direction. And I'm hopeful, borderline optimistic, that it's going to be successful.
What are your thoughts about the Belarus-Russian Ryanair event?
Yeah. Boy, the horror in Belarus is something we've seen for some time now, and our friend Christina and her family, of course, watch this particularly closely because this is their homeland, and my heart goes out to them and to their friends and family and loved ones who are still in that country. But as I know all of you saw in the news last night, the nation's leader essentially abducted a opposition journalist by forcing a international flight to land in Belarus under false pretenses. It's pretty clear in the immediate that this is going to increase the isolation for Belarus from the rest of Europe and for most of the rest of the world. But it's also instructive in the role that this discussion plays in the broader US-Russia relationship. And some of you may remember that a few weeks ago, I talked about how likely it was that Biden and Putin would schedule a summit in all likelihood for sometime in June after the end of the NATO and G7 meetings that are taking place next month. It was announced yesterday that that summit is taking place. So along with election interference, along with Ukraine, along with any number of other issues, expect that Belarus becomes part of that Biden-Putin agenda when they meet in Geneva in June.
Yeah, Christina's in the office or in the audience, as she said, to tell you thank you. Why do you think we are not hearing of voter suppression laws in various states being challenged in court by the Democrats?
I suspect we will. I think, first of all, challenging the law until it is passed and signed is legally much more difficult. This is one of the reasons that the less known legislation in Congress, the John Lewis Act, named after the late congressman and civil rights hero, is so important because it would reestablish an ability for the Justice Department to weigh in on these types of laws before they take place. But I am very confident that as Georgia and Texas and other states move forward with more restrictive voting legislation, once those bills are signed into law, while I won't predict the outcome of the lawsuits, I think you'll see a very, very aggressive legal pushback against them.
Dan, can you please comment on the current voting audit in Arizona and the new moves in Georgia, given your third topic today?
For the most part, I think they're sort of sideshows. The election, of course, has been decided, and while any citizen and every citizen's elected representative can continue to challenge the results, at this point, it seems to me that it's almost a cathartic thing for Trump's most loyal supporters to continue to push this forward. Now, I don't want to be dismissive of it because I think there's consequences of this type of debate and these types of reviews going on indefinitely. So that makes it much more difficult for democracy to function when a sizable plurality of the losing side won't admit that their side lost. But in the immediate, they're sort of silly, but they are indicators of a much bigger challenge we have in the US today, which is not just an electorate, but a society that is so incredibly polarized and hyper-partisan that the losing side, whether it's Republicans in Arizona this year or Democrats in Georgia 2 years ago, are not willing to accept the results. Now, before we get angry emails about moral equivalency, I will state that while Stacey Abrams supporters felt that they were wronged in the 2018 governor's race in Georgia, they did not go to these extraordinary and ridiculous lengths to try to overturn the results. My point is simply that when the losing side of an election doesn't want to accept the result, that makes governance harder and it makes democracy harder.
Quick question on California voting. Has the new method of determining districts been effective against gerrymandering in California?
Not completely, but largely. When California instituted a citizens commission to take care of redistricting and reapportionment, the line drawing for both the state legislature and for congressional districts, in the previous decade, between 2002 and 2012, I think I may have used this example with all of you in the past, there are, at least for now, 53 congressional seats in California. So over that 10-year period, 2002 to 2012, the 5 elections held before the implementation of the Citizens Commission. That means over that 10-year period, there were 265 elections for United States Congress, for the US House of Representatives in California. In 264 out of those 265 elections, the party that held the seat before the election held the seat after the election, either because the incumbent was reelected or a successor of the same party was elected in their place. In the 10 years since then, we've seen a couple of dozen seats change hands. And while that's not a seat change, because we're never going to be able to draw a competitive congressional district in Berkeley or in Southern Orange County, there are many areas of the state where people, because of their natural living tendencies, tend to group in very ideologically one-sided areas. But it's very clear to me that over the course of 10 years, we've seen a much greater number of competitive elections in California as a result of the Citizens Commission work than we had seen previously. And if you couple that redistricting reform with the implementation of the top 2 primary, while the system isn't perfect, I think it's much more improved in terms of giving a voice to California voters when they're picking their congressional and legislative representatives.
Thank you so much. And this will be our final question. Are the Democrats getting stuck? Oh, sorry, I just moved here. Are the Democrats getting stuck in an approach on infrastructure, voting rights, criminal justice reform, and other issues that they want the perfect rather than being willing to compromise and get something passed?
Well, this is a real tension within the Democratic Party, and we're seeing it this week over infrastructure legislation. Biden himself has indicated that he really does want to pass a bipartisan bill, and the White House has come down significantly from its overall cost for the infrastructure package in order to try to entice Republicans to participate and support the bill. We are seeing more progressive Democrats, most notably Senator Sanders, who are saying, hey, we tried to work with Republicans, enough of that, let's just do this on a straight party line vote. But on every one of these issues, it's pretty clear that Biden and the Democrats will not accomplish their policy goals unless they find a way to attract some type of bipartisan support. We're seeing, while it's moving very slowly, and we'll talk more about it next week, we're seeing really impressive progress taking place on a bipartisan basis on the issue of criminal justice reform. It's not done yet, but they're much more likely to accomplish a bill on this front because the Democrats have been willing to offer some concessions, not just to Republicans, but to more centrist members of their own party. I think the questioner's instinct is the right one. And whether it's a Democratic White House now or a Republican White House at some point in the past or the future, if you want to live in a democracy rather than a monarchy, you have to reconcile yourself to the idea that being in the majority, especially a narrow majority, doesn't entitle you to everything you want, just a good portion of it. And I think that type of outlook would be of great benefit to the president and his party on all of these fronts going forward. I agree with the questioner completely.
Great. Well, thank you so much again, Dan. And for our audience, again, thank you for your great questions. If you'd like to continue this conversation on what's happening in the Middle East, as Dan mentioned, please join us Thursday at 5 p.m. with Consul General Hillel Newman. And Dan and Kim, I'll turn this back over to you.
Thank you so much, Jessica. As always, really appreciate it.
Great job, Jessica, with the questions. Dan, what an important and timely discussion. We all learned so much in your programs. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kim. Thank you very much.
We have a terrific lineup of programs in addition to the program you're doing for us on Thursday, and of course, your politics in the time of coronavirus every Tuesday. In addition to Thursday's program, on Friday, we have a Creating Opportunity from Crisis, a very special program for high school students. On June 2nd, Notre Dame de Paris, Restoring a Gothic Masterpiece. On the 3rd of June, a special purpose acquisition companies, a hot topics for investors. This is with one of our board members, KPMG is bringing a panel of experts for future investments. June 7th, the future of gun policy and the Second Amendment. And on the 10th, a conversation with the California Lieutenant Governor. As we mentioned earlier at the beginning of the program, we're excited to bring back our in-person events, beginning with an exclusive members-only tour of a new exhibit at the Skirball Center in July. So if any of you are not yet members of the Council Town Hall, this is a terrific opportunity to join. We have a special travel program, film program, and exclusive events. So please go to our website and register for Dan's event Thursday and other upcoming events. Become a member, renew your membership, make a donation. We appreciate all of your support. So everybody take care, and we'll hope to see you Thursday.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Dan.
Thank you.